most 보던 팟캐스트.
So most fun podcast, right? We're almost at a year. We set out last year with a very ambitious goal of convening power in the built environment. I guess this is like a year check-in. Like, how do you guys think we did?
I think the conversations so far have been really rich. I think they've been progressively more interesting. And I think the reason for it is because they become more complex. I think we talk a lot about process, like what someone does, but we've been able to start to have conversations about how what somebody specializes in and what they focus on actually relates to other things. And I think that's our goal in general. Not necessarily to say, oh, this needs to change or this needs to change, but at the beginning to say, okay, these are the connections that form and shape the environment, and how does one fit themselves in, either at a personal level or at a more sort of structural, organizational level into that. I think one thing that understand about the built environment, something that I think about quite a lot is you shape your context, but you're also shaped by the context at the same time. But that's the exciting thing, and it's reciprocal. And so I think our motivation for the show has always been to establish a little bit more lines of communication between what's happening and who it's happening to. And I think that the possibilities are out there for how that occurs. And as we've encountered already, there's so many people who are in one way or another forming and shaping the world around us, either in purposefully or sort of on this by accident, maybe. I'm quite excited for it, and I think talking to you guys about it has always been a joy.
Failed to invite a plumber.
Yeah, we're still a plumber.
Hey, year two goal.
We should find the best plumber in the world. Like, who is Yelp's top-rated plumber?
Yeah, I'll reach out to it.
But I mean, this is also happening in a moment where I think I don't think we'll ever be over the pandemic. It's always going to be on our psyche, but we're in this moment where I think the issues, I see this in my work, the issues that were highlighted by the pandemic are becoming more, I think we're looking at them more objectively. We're not looking at them as a reaction necessarily. We're looking at them as a series of consequences that we have to address. And so what's been really eye-opening and I think uplifting for me is seeing how a lot of people around the world, especially, let's say, the generation who grew up during the pandemic, I'm not talking about went to school, but especially emerged into these professions, starts to take stock and say, hey, these are my issues that I need to take control over. And these are the ways that we're going to maybe be different from the people who taught us, but also lay claim to a territory that will have an impact for the next generation or two.
Yeah, I feel like, I don't know, like the pandemic has definitely, do you think the pandemic was one of the things that made us feel like we should start a podcast?
For sure. I feel that way.
Yeah, in a way, because the pandemic, you have a lot of free time to think about stuff, and you're at your home, you're at your house, trying to make sense of things, and the things that you didn't have enough time to think about. And I think it definitely nudged me to think more about the environment that you are in, that not the ones that you imagine and you want to build that's ideal and utopian for you, but it's more about what you can touch, like the tangible assets around you, how are you going to build your life, your family. It gave me more time to think about those things, and hence I think one of the aspects was to hear more about our stories from people who are doing a lot of different stuff in the built environment, but trying to listen from them and also to learn from them was the goal. So that is what motivates me to continue on doing this podcast.
I think the pandemic there's a couple of realizations. One is like what Minku is saying, when you're stuck in a place, you realize how important all those other places you can't go to are. Right. And then you start to think about, hey, I can't really experience the places that I can normally go to when I have more freedom. Why are they special? Why are they unique? The other thing that it totally changed is our messaging and our communication. We all realized, hey, you don't actually have to be in the same place to have meaningful conversations. People are working, people are going to school. You start connecting with people that aren't necessarily in your geography, but you might feel closer to than the ones who are. And I think for us, that was always actually, sometimes it's a limitation. Obviously, right now we're in the same place, and we would like to do this more often. But most of the time, we're in different places. And I think that the opportunity for the podcast is not to necessarily talk about just specific conditions, which often occur when you're in your job, right? Like you're in this one market, what is it like there? Or you have this one region, what is it like there? But we're able to talk about different things that are happening across this country and hopefully across the world too.
We also kind of create that like consistent exploration that kind of all three of us are on, like continuing to, the guests are different every week, right? But we are kind of moving the same conversation forward. And one thing that I thought was really cool was like, this first year was a lot of our friends. And I don't know, like when I meet up with friends over beer or something, I don't usually like dive in deep over like what they're doing or like what kind of mushrooms they're growing. But like, it was really cool to be able to kind of like hear from like our friends what they're passionate about, where that passion came from, and how they see their work impacting the world.
Yeah. So maybe the one thing that we need to focus on is now like break out of that circle and try to invite people who are not necessarily within our network of people, our network of friends, but who are more established or who are less established. Like I think the next step for me is to broaden that spectrum and try to hear more opinions and stories about their experiences.
Yeah, no, I think that's our shared goal for sure. It is nice to talk to people who you're familiar with, and not only are a lot of these people, personal friends, but we've also worked with them. And I think one thing that's quite interesting is to sort of check back with somebody that was your colleague 6 years ago, and you both came from the same place, or maybe your classmate came from the same place, but now we're bifurcating a little bit. We're doing our own thing, they're doing theirs, but that there's still a connection, and that we recognize that what we're doing and what they're doing is also important. And that in the built environment, you're not going to be able to do anything by your own. I think the thing that the reason behind the show is basically, there's so many challenges, and a lot of that is not necessarily what you know. It's a lot about who you know and how you can work together on those things. And just building a building, you can't do it by yourself in the first place. So how are you going to make the more sustainable building? How are you going to make the more affordable building? You're going to have to take what somebody else has done and merge it with what you've done.
It's so intricate, right? We're just like scratching the surface. Like we talk about zoning, we talk about policy, we talk about materials, right? Like all of these things shape what's possible. And I think no single guest that we've had on was like, hey, like I understand everything. Let me give you the ABC.
Yeah, it's not possible. Yeah.
Master architects are not a thing anymore. Like, I mean, do you think it is possible to be a master architect?
No, absolutely not. Because as we've discovered, what shapes the building or the habitat or whatnot is not necessarily just the form. It's also all these other things that dictate how much you can build, how costly it's going to be, who's going to use it, where it's going to be, all these sorts of things. So I think, one of the nice things about globalization is that we have a lot of people who can then come in and play a role and the other thing about the pandemic is we realize that something that happens in one place can affect a lot of people. Right? I think that's also very key too, whereas the built environment has always been about, the local condition. And there's aspects of global architecture, sort of an international design scene or building cultures or whatnot. But a lot of what takes place occurs because someone has done it in one place and then somebody else had it in another place and said, oh, how can I do that here?
Yeah.
I would think that what I'm looking forward to in the show is basically trying to expand that conversation even more, build off what we've already talked about. I don't think there's anything that, it's a form of research in a way.
Right.
I don't want to be too academic about this, but we're all learning, and I think hopefully we're sharing that with our audience too. But that some of these connections and the web of ideas that form what we see around us can start to clarify so that we can look at new challenges and new problems with a little bit more confidence and with a little bit more clarity as to, how did we get here in the first place, and then therefore how we can move out of it potentially. The problems are myriad, but I also think that what's been really exciting has been talking to people who are very optimistic.
Right.
It's like, yes, this is a problem, and this is how we're going to fix it.
Yeah. Well, without the problem, how would their job won't be there?
Well, yeah, but that's value, right?
Yeah.
But they can choose to do their jobs in many different ways. I think, you do hear a lot of like frustration with like the current state of things, and it's a lot of people who deal with the problem the same way over and over again with a solution that's not very optimal or not very pleasant. And especially as like designers, it's painful to like just see these things happen in our built environment, right? But a lot of our our guests do have that passion, do have to say, okay, like I'm gonna take that risk, I'm gonna go do something different, I'm gonna tell you what could work, just so we can potentially get to that better future.
This is something different, but I feel like throughout the podcast, it was us kind of talking and then you were hosting. I wonder, we have a small group of following. I wonder if there's a way where we can hear from the followers of what they thought about it and how they want us to go, or if they can recommend anyone or any place to go. So maybe that's something.
Yeah, we are Most Modern on Instagram, and you can email, was it the Most Modern Podcast on Gmail? We would love to hear from some folks.
Yeah, please. Any comments will be welcome.
Yeah, tell us our audio balancing sucks.
Which we're working on. There is a technical aspect of running a show, which I think none of us were completely prepared for.
Well, maybe let's talk about like some of the things we learned about just like running a podcast, because I think before coming into this, none of us did anything like this before, right? It's all learning from scratch.
Yeah, I think the way of speaking, it definitely gave me a lot of opportunity to speak in public, not in public, but like speak with other people on a somewhat quasi-professional setting to talk about their work. And I think the skill is, like, you don't want to make it sound too professional. And I don't know if I'm achieving it, but I'm trying to, unlock it in a way that is more accessible and also try to, simplify a very complex concept of things. And I think those are the, beauties of being on a podcast, is that you don't have to do a super deep dive of things, but you can go deeper in a certain level, but still, have it sound entertaining. So that's something that I want to work on, continue.
I think, like in any pursuit, communication is key.
Yeah.
Unless you're only doing something with your body, or you're only doing something like purely artistic. Anytime you're working with somebody else, you have to be able to communicate clearly. And I think the show is really up to my sort of standard for how I communicate. It's still a lot of room for improvement, but it's been difficult because I think the big challenge that, and we addressed this at the beginning, was that we were dealing with mostly visual things, but with a primarily audio medium. And so I think if I were to point to a solution so far, it's really describing the conditions in a way. I think that's forced us to describe the conditions in a way that is accessible to people, which is, we're not just talking to architects or developers or planners. Like we're hopefully talking to a lot of different people. And so to get to the essence of the point, I think is really hard. And a lot of that is incumbent on our guests, but we're trying to, as hosts, to try to get that out of them and make it easier for them.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point with like communication, because like I think one thing we pick up a lot is like the different languages that you need in the built environment. Right. And like for me, as someone who's like moved into tech in the past few years, like re-immersing myself in that language has been really challenging. Like it tickles a part of my brain that I don't use a lot anymore, that I now get to use a lot more on this podcast. But it is like that, right? Like designers have a certain way of talking, like planners have a certain way of talking, and not only do I feel like we're getting access to that, but also we're helping that communicate to a potentially different set of audiences that might not be used to that language. And like being able to adapt to that is a skill that I think we're gaining a lot.
Yeah, I mean, it's a question that we've been asking to a lot of our guests too, is how do you pick that up? And to be honest, it's like any language. You don't have to speak it fluently. You don't have to be a native. But I think we're starting to see more and more, I tell my students this, and I'm sure you guys feel the same way, is like, if you want to have agency in what gets built and what gets created, you do have to be able to speak those languages. One, it's an interpersonal thing. It's like, I see you, I understand you. But two, I mean, it's also like, there's a lot of complicated forces out there, financial, political, scientific now, climate in general and stuff like that, if you want to do this stuff, it's hard. You have to learn. But the only way you learn is by exposing yourself. And I think that's one, if I were to boil it down to, besides the messages that we're providing, I would like to expose our audience to those languages so that they at least are aware, maybe I should go sort of brush up on my macroeconomics, or maybe I should brush up on my building code knowledge or whatnot.
Well, that's one consistent aspect that we tackled, and I think we successfully delivered, is that I tried to show ways outside of the typical like design, like being a master designer, being like the Pritzker Prize winner, which is certainly a valid way, but it's not the only way. And I think we were consistent in that message and successful in engaging people who are not necessarily on that route, maybe at some point. But they're not only doing design work on their desk and like only sketching. They are trying to achieve that. Maybe not that, but like trying to practice architecture in a different way. So that was quite meaningful.
Yeah, I mean, we talk about how we generally think that disciplines, domains, fields shouldn't be siloed.
Mm-hmm.
I think one thing that we're starting to see is there's a lot of people who feel the same way, and either consciously are saying, okay, I need to do this hybrid role, I need to speak these other languages, or just even in the task at hand, like this is what we have to do, you know, like Brian Lee, right? Like he's building a building and also looking at mushrooms too, you know, that's not necessarily, that's what Autodesk is looking at, you know, and the demands and the value that people are placing on professionals are to be able to synthesize, to be able to take existing information in addition to new information, but to be able to create meaning out of that. I think that's quite interesting, and I'm seeing also as people reach out who, you know, on a personal level about the show, like they are interested in how do you take your basis, whatever that is, whether it's design or finance or implementation, how do you take that basis and level it up so that you can start to work with other people? There's been no shortage of, like, I think, collaborative spirit that we've experienced. Like, everybody recognizes that this is important, but easier said than done. And I think that if we should have a bias towards cooperation as opposed to isolation. Starting to emerge for sure.
Yeah. I just feel like it's been tough. It's been a tough slog this year trying to get to this point. But I feel like it's been well worth it with all the things we learned and like all the things that we've been able to produce. I guess when looking back at the year, what would you say is your proudest moment of Most Modern?
I think the first episode, to be honest, we had Jackie on. Our tech was not good. It was messed up, and we had a great conversation. And I think, you know, she was a great first guest. I mean, she's incredible in a lot of ways. But just saying that, realizing, okay, this is a show, this is a podcast, but it's just a conversation at the end of the day. And, you know, it could have been a Zoom call between a bunch of people, and, you know, just opening that up. I think that was really what spurred me to keep going the first, you know, attempt. Even as awkward, as difficult, and as sort of, as much as I realized that there is a lot of room for improvement, that was quite fun, actually.
I think for me, it was like when I would be like listening to podcasts on the train, and then, you know, how automatically goes to the next one, and it would be our podcast, and it would sound like a real podcast. And I was like, holy crap, it's like, this is really interesting. Like, how do we get in here?
That happened to me the other day. My neighbor, we went to the grocery store together, and I got in his car, and then he's listening to a podcast, and I was like, that's Lebo.
I think one thing that I've also enjoyed is like, you know, you guys both come from OMA, like very rigorous, very high design, right? But it's like, you also bring that mentality into the design of the podcast, right? Like we, you know, in the back of the scenes, we discuss a lot about how we get better, how we can improve, like what aspects to improve. And that's one thing that I would look forward to kind of in the next year is like, okay, like we've gotten here, we've improved a lot of things, but next year's only going to get better.
Sure. Yeah. Well, the interesting thing is having a weekly format like this, you have to iterate.
Yeah,
and if you, it only is synonymous with iteration. So I don't want to harp too much on our former employer, but yeah, you have to try. And I often show my students this, it's called Austin's butterfly. I show it to basically every class. And it's this image of a butterfly, and it's like a 9-year-old kid, and they're like, draw a butterfly. And they say, okay, Austin, draw another butterfly. And he does it 6 times, presumably one after another. And the first one is just a sort of scribble, and the final one looks like a real butterfly. And I think that that's, it's something that I always constantly have to remind myself, is like, look, iteration is critical, both in podcasting, but also in the built environment, in making things. And I think that growth is also really exciting too. You know.
Yeah. Where do you want to take this podcast next season? Or not next year?
Well, one thing that we started to do is start to go a bit more global, right? Like I think talking to people in other parts of the world who are facing at one time different challenges, but also some similar ones too. Like housing continues to be an issue everywhere. Climate continues to be an issue everywhere. And seeing how they approach things, you know, the culture around building, the culture around doing things in one place or another, and having that exchange. I think that's something that this format really allows us to do. We don't have to fly there
Yeah,
necessarily.
that would be so interesting, especially in terms of housing, because Asia is dealing with with such a different set of problems.
Right.
I see that as oversupply, where here is undersupply.
Yeah.
Really the policies and the processes around how to build is impacting that supply issues. So, yeah, I mean, we should have more internationals.
I mean, I think I'm just looking forward to more conversation. And I think each one we have, like, I learn a little bit more. And when I listen to it again, I learn more things. And I just feel like it's such a great avenue for me of like personal growth and, you know, having conversations with both of you, but in context with like what the guest is bringing to the table. I feel like we, especially in our more recent recordings, have reached a great way of just like clawing a little bit below the surface and really getting into some of the meat and some of the details of what they do.
Yeah, I think if I'm focusing on something that I want to improve on is to get deeper. Right? It's hard in a short form podcast. We could do something like Joe Rogan where we just go on for 3 hours. We're not quite there yet, but I do think that like being more exacting and getting to the root of the issue and then expanding on that is something that I would like to focus on a little bit more. But to your point about learning, there's this great quote by Ray Dalio, the hedge fund guy. He's like, if you don't look back on yourself a year ago and say, wow, how dumb was I back then, then you haven't learned enough. And I think hopefully anybody who's been listening to us the whole time has learned quite a lot, and not to insult anybody, but hopefully you're much smarter now than before. I think we certainly are in terms of what we know.
Well, I think I learned a lot by going back and listening to our early episodes.
Sure. Yeah, and we're very humble about this. We're not putting on any pretenses that was anything like Emmy worthy or anything. But I think that there's a lot that you can learn by just putting your work out there and just having these discussions. The other great quote I have is Virgil Abloh, which is like, if you put something out there and nobody notices, no big deal. But if you put something out there and someone picks it up, then it can happen. So it's almost another like, you miss 100% of the shots you don't take. I got quotes and quotes and quotes.
That's what you need to bring to season 2, more quotes.
Well, yeah, we talked about, because of our professions and the areas that we're interested in, I think we talked mostly about the design and the development aspect and how those can work together. But I think maybe I had most fun when I was talking to designers, because doing much of design when I compared to before. So maybe one thing that I would like to bring in next season or next year is to also like try to hear more from the designers, what they're facing, not necessarily in terms of development issues, but the design itself can be an interesting subject.
Designers are interesting because they're inherently solution-oriented.
Yeah.
One could say they're too solution-oriented, just the product matters. And I think the ones that we talk to, especially the ones younger in their career, they do have to focus on the process much more. Like, it's not like they're getting hired just because of their name. They're hired because they can get the thing done.
Yeah.
And I think that that's one thing too that it's been really great working with both of you on this, is trying to get at the meat of the problem and then saying, okay, what do we do about it, right? But I think that that's occurring when we talk to our guests who are involved in tech, who are providing platforms and tools to help improve situations, or anybody who's working at a sort of consulting level as well, looking at much larger problems that not one person is ever going to be able to figure out. So I think that this is something that also keeps you going. It's very easy to get bogged down in all the challenges these days, but I think keeping a level head and saying, okay, we can figure this out, is something that I hope that we're also providing a platform for.
Yeah, and also that everyone's figuring it out. Yeah, right? I don't think any of our guests were not figuring it out.
Yeah.
Sometimes in the progress of the podcast, they're figuring stuff out.
There's a great meme about figuring it out. But I think it could be the alternative name for the podcast too. I think, in life we're just trying to figure it out, and I think that's the sort of in the build environment, and when we're talking about shaping our own habitats, like we're just learning at the same time.
It's a great journey to be on. I think, to have partners, a lot of people do podcasts on their own, right? But I think the three of us, some of us have higher energy in certain times, some of us have lower energy, but the three of us kind of keep each other going. And I think part of what I feel really good about is we've been pretty persistent. Like, we haven't let ourselves slip very many times, and when we do, we really take it pretty harshly.
Yeah, I mean, it's quite fascinating because we've all done big projects in our life. We've been part of them, but I think this is one that feels very big in terms of sort of like the outreach, right? Like this goes out to the world, and at the same time very intimate.
Right.
Like we just sit down and talk, and I would encourage anybody who's interested in getting to having more conversations to really do that and really focus on not just the talking aspect of it, but getting the message across, figuring out new things, innovating in a way. So I think this has been a very different type of project than we've ever worked on before. But I was sort of ready for it.
Do you think we chose the right format? Do you think the podcast is the perfect kind of intersection between that intimacy and...
It is very intimate because, imagine you're in someone's ear, basically. I think that we are in an attention economy right now, which is, at least on the sort of operations and business side, is basically our major hurdle. But at the same time, like if there's a niche out there for understanding and for knowledge, which I don't think will ever go away, understanding why the condition is the way it is, I think it's a good spot for it.
Yeah, I wish our podcast can be the go-to podcast when you're doing dishes.
But or walking around the city,
walking around,
or
driving,
going out to the countryside. But I think part of why we started this was like there was no podcast out there for us to listen to while we're doing these things that talked about a topic that we're really interested in, right? And I'm sure we're not the only ones who are interested in these things.
Right.
Yeah.
So I think, I'm excited to keep going on that for sure.
Should we ask ourselves the question?
Oh, what the MoPo question?
Yeah.
Where are we in the year 2024?
After a year of MoPo, right?
We know which era are we in right now? After a year in review of MoPoing, where do we stand?
I think a year ago I said this was the most modern era, but I think after we've talked to so many people, I think maybe it's the pandemic. I think it's in a way like an age of reflection, right? We're looking at where we were, where we are now, everything around us a little bit more closely, and I think a lot of our guests kind of brought that in. Like they've looked at their careers, they looked at what they want to do, they looked at the world around them, and then they reflected and made a conscious decision like, hey, I'm going to do this as a next step. And I think there is probably a lot of people doing that, thinking that they're alone or they're in a small cohort, but it's going to really create this big movement where we're going to see a lot of changes really quickly.
Well, when I think about postmodern or where we are now, I have this image of Rick and Morty, where there are multiple universes, but I think those exist, but not in multiple different universes, but in this universe, but different worlds exist, and everyone has their own world, and we are trying to just connect them. So I still think that most modern is where we are now. It's the hodgepodge and a mix of different ideas, but people are trying to figure it out, and I hope the subjects that we talk will be helpful for any of the people who are trying to do more and actually help them to do what they wanted. So that's still stay the same.
Yeah, I think this probably clarified for me in the past couple of months, which is, especially as I reflect on my own career and what I'm trying to do professionally, in addition to the show. I think that we're in a moment where the challenges and the opportunities are very close,
right,
but they're facing different directions, meaning they're basically two sides of the same coin. And everyone has the opportunity to, yes, you have to deal with the challenges, but that also gives you clarity, gives you a mission, it gives you something to focus on and do. It gives us something to respond to. And, it's, for instance, like you talk about climate, it's not just to solve climate, it's also to solve the climate change situation, and then make the world a better place too at the same time, right? It's not like we're just, I would say the pandemic at first felt like it was a situation where like, oh my God, how are we going to deal with this? But there has been a lot that has changed out of that. So every reaction has another reaction. It's just a sequence of things that happen over and over. And so for anybody involved in any of the professions we talk about, but even those who aren't, maybe who are listening just out of curiosity, I think that we're in the moment where you get to decide, am I going to look at something as a chance to fail, or am I going to look at something as a chance to prove what we can do? And there's just, you open up the news every single day, especially around technology, like there's so many innovations that are occurring. I would take a lot of energy from that. And I think that, the built environment sometimes it lags when it comes to evolution, but at the same time, it is also lasting when it comes to a lot of the world that we envision in the future. So that's where I think we are. We're on a knife's edge between challenges and opportunities. And it's up to you to decide which side you want to go towards.
Yeah. To add to that, I think there was a time when critical thinking was very important. But with critical thinking now, with the amount of data and access to information, you can actually not stop at the level of thinking. You can actually, with that critical thinking process, do something that you think will make the impact. So we're at that tipping point where if you have the right mind and the right intention, if you have a channel that you can funnel your energy, you can actually make it work because the information is out there. And our podcast is. Hopefully it can be a platform for us to feed you those informations even more and almost directly from the professionals who are in that and doing that work to share that knowledge.
Maybe just as a final question, sort of question to everybody, what do you hope that people take away from the show? If you're listening for the first time or if you've been with us for a while.
I can start with that. Just do it. Just do it. The mentality of doing. And not just complain about things, not stopping there. Just try to do it and make it your own reality.
It is my favorite corporate slogan. Just do it.
Just
I think it's honest.
They changed it once to because ... That was like in the 90s. They went back. So no one knows about that.
For me, I think it's really sort of what you were talking about, Minker, realizing that there are other people out there doing similar things, and that all these people that we've met, very nice, very approachable. Like there's nothing stopping you now to send an email, to reach out, to do things. The only thing that creates friction mostly is time and energy. But if you can start to develop a position, start to develop a body of work, and start to develop your sort of perceived value, there's nothing that's preventing you from actually engaging with others and start to do more things. So I hope that we can serve every week as an opportunity for you to encounter something you would normally not encounter.
I think for me, it's like ask that question. And I think a lot of times on the show, we've had surprising answers to some of the things that we're curious about. And, so much of our information is kind of pushed to us at this point that, it is, to your benefit to take it, have your agency in how you explore the world. And I think that's something that we do on the show and something that hopefully our listeners will take away.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a great note to wrap on. So here's to another year of the show. It's been a fun ride so far, guys. So I'm looking forward to what we have in store.
And if you're listening, please send us feedback. We take feedback well. So
very serious.
Most modern.
Most modern.
Most modern.
Most modern. 모스트 포던 팟캐스트